worst part wasn't finding my daughter-in-law unconscious on the kitchen floor. The worst part was realizing I had handed my son the keys to destroy her, and smiled while doing it. Let me back up. My name is Eugene. I'm 64 years old. I spent 31 years as a high school history teacher in Dayton, Ohio, and I retired thinking I understood people, thinking I could read a room, read a situation, read a man's character. 31 years of teenagers trying to pull one over on me. I figured that made me sharp, perceptive, hard to fool. I was wrong. The person who fooled me wasn't a teenager. He was my own son, and I helped him do it. My son's name is Nolan. He's 37. Built like me. Broad shoulders, dark eyes, the kind of jaw that makes people think you're serious, even when you're not. He got my stubbornness too, though I didn't see it as stubbornness back then. I called it drive. I called it ambition. Nolan always knew what he wanted, and he always found a way to get it. I was proud of that. Lord help me, I was so proud of that. Lord help me, I was so proud of that. He met Yuna about 4 years ago. She was working as a physical therapist at a clinic downtown, and they met when Nolan came in for a shoulder injury. She's Korean American, second generation, grew up in Columbus. Quiet, careful with her words, the kind of person who listens more than she talks, which I mistook for coldness the first time I met her. I'll be honest with you, I didn't dislike Yuna, but I didn't go out of my way to know her either. She was different from the women Nolan had dated before, different in ways I couldn't quite name but noticed anyway. She didn't laugh loudly at my jokes. She didn't fill silences with small talk. At Thanksgiving, she would help clear the dishes without being asked, but she'd do it quietly, efficiently, like she was trying to take up as little space as possible. I told myself she was shy. I told myself she just needed time to warm up to us. What I didn't tell myself, what I refused to examine, was that maybe she wasn't cold. Maybe she was careful. Maybe there was a reason she moved through my family's house like a woman watching for exits. They got married in the spring of the year before last. Small ceremony. Yuna's parents flew in from Columbus. Lovely people, warm and gracious in a way that made me feel, if I'm honest, slightly ashamed of how little effort I'd made. Her mother kept thanking me for welcoming Yuna into our family. I smiled and said, of course. I meant it, I think. At the time, I meant it. They bought a house about 40 minutes from me, in a quiet neighborhood outside of Beaver Creek. Nice street, big trees. The kind of place where neighbors know each other's names and wave from driveways. The neighbor on the left side of their house was a man named Pete Galveston, retired firefighter. Maybe 68, 69. Big white mustache, the kind that makes a man look like he belongs in a different century. He and his wife had lived on that street for 22 years. He walked his dog every morning at 7, every evening at 6. You could set a clock by Pete. I met Pete exactly twice before everything happened. Once at a summer cookout Nolan and Yuna hosted. Once in the driveway when I stopped by to drop off some furniture Nolan had asked to borrow. Both times Pete struck me as a decent, straightforward man. The kind of man who minded his business, but not in an unfriendly way. I never imagined Pete Galveston would be the person who saved my daughter-in-law's life. It was a Thursday in late October. The leaves had just turned, and the morning had that particular chill that means winter is done pretending it isn't coming. I drove out to Beaver Creek to drop off a box of books Nolan had asked for, some of my old history textbooks he said he wanted for reference. He wasn't home when I arrived. He texted me earlier saying he'd be back by noon, and it was about 11:40, so I figured I'd wait in the driveway. I had just gotten out of my car when Pete came out of his house. He wasn't walking his dog, he wasn't in his usual routine. He walked straight toward me, and his face, I noticed it immediately, was not the face of a man making neighborly small talk. His jaw was set. His eyes were fixed on mine. "Eugene," he said, "you got a minute?" Something in his voice made me set the box down. We stood at the edge of his property, and Pete talked for about 15 minutes, quietly, carefully, like a man who had rehearsed this but wasn't sure he was going to go through with it until the last moment. He told me he'd been watching things at Nolan and Yuna's house for close to 8 months. He told me about the shouting, and he was specific, so specific that I couldn't write it off. He said it was always Nolan's voice. Always. In 8 months of living 30 feet from their front door, he had never once heard Yuna raise her voice. He'd heard her crying twice late at night when the windows were open. He said the crying wasn't the kind that comes from a bad day. It was the kind that had been going on for a long time. He told me about the morning 3 weeks earlier when he was loading his car at 6 a.m. and saw Yuna come outside in a long-sleeve shirt on a 60-degree morning. She was taking the trash to the curb. She saw him, and she tugged his sleeve down. A small gesture, almost reflexive. He said he'd seen that gesture before, in his years as a firefighter responding to domestic calls. He said he didn't know what to do with it, and he'd been sitting on it, and he couldn't sit on it anymore. I stood there, and I listened to all of it. And then, God forgive me, my first instinct was to defend my son. I told Pete that Nolan had a temper. Sure, always had, but that didn't mean anything beyond that. I told him that marriages go through rough patches. I told him that Yuna was private, that she didn't express herself the way we did, that maybe what looked like distress from the outside was just her personality. I told him he'd misread the sleeve thing. I told him I appreciated his concern, but I knew my son. Pete listened to all of that. When I was done, he looked at me for a moment and said, "I hope you're right, Eugene. I really do." And then he went back inside. I stood in that driveway for a long time. The book stayed in my car. I drove home. I told myself I'd handled it correctly. I told myself Pete was a good man, but he was projecting. Too many years of responding to calls had given him a hair trigger. I told myself Nolan was my son, and I knew him better than any neighbor ever could. I kept telling myself that for about 3 weeks. Then my daughter-in-law called me on a Tuesday afternoon. It was the first time she had ever called me. Just her, not Nolan, just Yuna calling Eugene's phone. She said, "Hi, I just wanted to check in." Her voice was careful, measured. Like each word was a step on ice she wasn't sure would hold. We talked for maybe 10 minutes. She asked about my health. She asked if I was keeping busy in retirement. She laughed at something I said. A small laugh. Quiet, but real. And then right before she hung up, she said, "I'm glad Nolan has you." I really am. The way she said it, past tense almost, like she was wrapping something up, made the hairs on my arms stand up. I didn't call her back. I didn't call Nolan. I sat with that feeling, and I let it fade. The way you let an uncomfortable thing fade when you don't want to deal with it. 4 days later, Nolan called me, casually, told me he was going out of town for work for the weekend, a conference in Indianapolis, and asked if I could check on the house Saturday morning, something about a package he was expecting. I said sure, of course. I drove out Saturday morning. The street was quiet. The big trees dropped leaves onto the sidewalk in slow orange spirals. I walked up to the front door and I rang the bell because even though Nolan had given me a spare key, it felt strange to just walk in. No answer. I rang again. Waited. Thought maybe Yuna had gone out. I was reaching into my pocket for the key when Pete's front door opened and he came out at a half jog, not running, but moving with a purpose that was unmistakable. Eugene. He reached me before I got the key into the lock. "Something's wrong. I heard a crash last night around 10. I knocked this morning and got no answer. I could hear the television on inside. I don't remember deciding to use the key. My hand just did it. The television was on in the living room. The sound of a morning news program filled the house with an ordinary, terrible normalcy. There was a glass broken on the kitchen floor, and Yuna was on the floor beside the island counter, her back against the cabinet, her knees drawn up. She was conscious. Barely. Her eyes were open, and she looked up at me, and she said my name, Eugene, just once, very quietly, like she'd been waiting. I called 911. Pete was already on his phone. We stayed with her until the ambulance came. At the hospital, they told me she had a concussion, bruised ribs, two of them cracked, and a laceration on her forearm that had been poorly bandaged, which Pete later told me he thought she'd done herself in the night, trying to take care of it and hide it. She had been on the floor since sometime the previous evening. She had not called for help. I called Nolan from the hospital waiting room. He answered on the second ring, sounding normal, relaxed. I told him Yuna was in the hospital. He said, "What? What happened? Is she okay?" All the right words in the right order. I told him to come home. While I waited for him, I sat in a chair by the window, and I thought about Pete's face in my driveway 3 weeks ago. I thought about the sleeve being tugged down. I thought about Yuna's voice on the phone saying, "I'm glad Nolan has you," like a goodbye dressed up as small talk. And I thought about every time I had looked at my son and seen what I wanted to see. Nolan arrived at the hospital at 2:30. He walked in looking disheveled from the drive, genuinely upset in appearance. And maybe some of it was genuine. I don't know. I don't know anymore what was genuine in my son. He went straight to Yuna's room and I followed him. Yuna was sitting up in the bed. Her face was calm in the way that faces go calm when they have made a decision and are waiting for the moment to execute it. When Nolan came in, she looked at him with an expression I had never seen on her face before. Not fear, not the careful, walking on eggshells composure she usually wore around him. Something older than fear, something that had been decided. She looked at him and she said, "I'm not coming home." Nolan started talking, reassurances, explanations. She'd hit her head. She needed to rest. Things had been stressful. They would work through it. He had an answer for everything. He always had an answer for everything. He always had an answer for everything. Yuna looked at me, just looked at me. And I understood that she was asking me something without words. She was asking me whether I was going to keep doing what I'd been doing. I told my son to step outside. He looked at me. "Dad, step outside, Nolan." He stepped outside, Nolan. He stepped outside. I sat in the chair beside Yuna's bed and I told her I was sorry. I didn't dress it up or walk it back or soften it with qualifications. I said, "I'm sorry. I saw signs and I looked away and I am so sorry." She didn't say anything for a long moment. Then she nodded, "Just months," and her eyes got bright, and she pressed her lips together. She told me everything that afternoon. She had been trying to leave for 7 months. Every time she had tried, Nolan had escalated, not with physical violence at first, but with a kind of economic and emotional strangulation that had left her unable to move. He had gotten her to consolidate their bank accounts after the wedding. She had agreed because she trusted him and because it seemed practical. And then, gradually, he had taken over paying all the bills, managing all the accounts, and reduced her access until she was essentially asking him for money to buy groceries. He had convinced her to reduce her hours at the clinic. "We don't need the income. Focus on yourself." Until she was down to 2 days a week and had less and less professional connection to the outside world. He had been subtle about her friends and family, never forbidding anything, just making things harder, making his displeasure known in the careful way that never leaves fingerprints. The physical violence had started 8 months ago, which I realized with a hollow feeling was exactly when Pete had started noticing. Yuna had not told her parents because she was ashamed and because she didn't want to frighten them. She had not told her coworkers because she barely saw them anymore. She had not called a hotline because Nolan monitored their cell phone plan and could see call logs. She had called me 4 days before because she wanted to hear one time if I sounded like someone who would help her. She was testing the temperature of the water before deciding whether to jump. I asked her if she had a plan. She said she had a bag packed and hidden at the clinic. She had $43 in cash she had accumulated from returning grocery items over 3 months, keeping the cash instead of swiping the card. $43. That was the sum total of her escape fund. I cannot tell you what it felt like to hear that. I am 64 years old, and I have sat with my share of hard truths, but that one, $43, 3 months of returns, 11 cents at a time, that one sat in my chest like a stone and hasn't fully left. Nolan was arrested that afternoon. Pete had already given a statement to the police. The hospital had documented her injuries. There was more. The police would find it eventually. The financial records, the call logs, the text that spelled it out plainly to anyone willing to read them. Nolan had not been careful because he had not believed anyone would look. Why would anyone look? He had his father on his side. He had a father who had been given signs and had chosen, deliberately and repeatedly, not to read them. The weeks after that were the hardest and the strangest of my life. Nolan was charged with domestic battery and separately with financial abuse, which is an actual charge in Ohio and carries real weight. He hired a good attorney. He had money of his own. His salary as a project manager had always gone into a separate account that Yuna didn't know about, which told you everything you needed to know about how long he had been planning the arrangement of their marriage. That particular discovery, the secret account, the premeditation of it, was the thing that finally burned away the last of my instinct to make excuses for him. Yuna moved into a furnished apartment with help from a domestic violence organization out of Dayton called Artemis House. I had not known it existed. I had lived in the city for 30 years and had no idea that 15 minutes from my house there was a building full of people whose entire purpose was to help women in exactly the situation my daughter-in-law had been in. I made a donation. It felt inadequate. I made a larger one. Her parents drove up from Columbus the week after the arrest. Her mother, a small woman with silver-streaked hair and the posture of someone who has survived difficult things quietly, sat across from me in Yuna's new apartment and held my hands in both of hers and said she didn't blame me. I told her she should. She shook her head and said blame wasn't what her daughter needed from me now. What her daughter needed was different. Then she told me what that looked like. I listened. That was new for me. Just listening without preparing a response. Yuna's divorce was finalized faster than you might expect. Nolan, facing the full weight of the financial abuse charge on top of the battery, agreed to a settlement that included restoring what he had removed from her, access to joint accounts, return of specific assets she had brought into the marriage, and a cash payment that gave her time to rebuild. Her attorney was a woman named Cheryl, who looked like someone's grandmother and argued like someone's worst nightmare, and she made sure that what was Yuna's was returned to Yuna. It was Cheryl, actually, who pointed out in a meeting that the financial abuse documentation also provided grounds for Yuna to sue in civil court for the income she had lost when Nolan had gradually pressured her out of her full-time position. That case is still pending. I hope it goes the way it should. Nolan pled guilty to the battery charge in a plea agreement and received 2 years probation, mandatory counseling, and a no-contact order. The financial abuse charge resulted in an additional condition of financial restitution. There are people who will look at those penalties and say they aren't enough. They aren't wrong. There are also people who say accountability without prison still counts for something. I hold both of those things at the same time and try not to let the tension between them make me stop paying attention. I see Yuna every few weeks now. She went back to full-time at the clinic. She's been promoted. She supervises 2 newer therapists now. She has her own account, her own car, her own lease that is in her own name. Small things that should have always been small things. We have coffee. We talk about normal things. Her patients, my garden, books I've been reading since I'm not teaching anymore. She laughs more than she used to. The careful watchfulness has not entirely left her eyes, but it sits differently now, not braced for impact, just attentive. She told me recently that she had driven past Pete's street on the way somewhere and thought of that morning when I'd walked into the house and called her name. She said she had thought on the floor, that no one was coming, that she had made her phone inaccessible on purpose. She had known Nolan could see the logs, and she'd been afraid of what would happen when he got home if she called anyone. She thought she was going to wake up the next day and call in sick to her 2 days of work and figure out something. Somehow. Still, she said she had thought, nobody is coming. She said when she heard the key in the lock, she thought it was Nolan, and she had been preparing herself for that. When she looked up and saw me, she said, she thought, oh, it's the wrong one. The one who might help. The wrong one. The one who might help. I've thought about that phrase more than I can tell you. The wrong one. Wrong, as in, not the person she feared. The one who might, not would, not definitely, just might help. That was all she could say about me. Might. That is not the story I would have told about myself before all this. I thought I was the right one, the good one, the steady father who knew his children, who had the wisdom of experience, who couldn't be fooled by a teenager, and certainly couldn't be fooled by his own son. Pete sold his house last spring. He and his wife retired down to Florida. They have grandchildren in Sarasota. I drove out to say goodbye on his last day, and I stood on that strip of lawn where he had stopped me in October, and I shook his hand for a long time. I thanked him. He said what he'd done wasn't anything. He just told me what he saw. He said the rest was me. I'm not sure I deserved that grace, but I'm trying to earn it backward. There is a version of this story where I keep doing what I was doing, where I stand in that driveway and I hear Pete out, and I go home, and I let another month pass, and then another, and something worse happens. I know that version exists. I live close enough to it to feel its temperature. What I know now, at 64, that I should have known 20 years ago. Watching someone you love is not the same as seeing them. I watched my son his whole life. I saw the version of him I had decided on when he was 7 years old, and determined and bright-eyed and mine. I kept seeing that boy even when the man in front of me was doing things that boy would never have done, or maybe would have. Maybe I didn't see the boy clearly either. Yuna came to my house for dinner 2 months ago and brought flowers from her own garden. She has a small patio at her apartment, and she's been growing things. Marigolds and rosemary and a tomato plant that she says is doing better than expected. She put the flowers in a jar on my kitchen table and she sat across from me and we ate the chicken soup I'd made and we talked about a documentary she'd watched and a history book I'd recommended and her mother's recent hip replacement. Before she left, she hugged me. Not a polite hug, a real one. The kind where the other person holds on for a second longer than you expect. Like they mean it. I don't know if I've earned that either. But I held on too, and I am trying, every day, to be the person that Hug says she thinks I am. I keep coming back to the $43. Not the arrest, not the hospital, not the courtroom. The $43 that Yuna had saved over 3 months by returning grocery items and pocketing the cash 11 cents at a time. Because that was the only money in her life that Nolan couldn't see. That number tells you everything about what I allowed to exist inside my own family while I was busy deciding I already understood the situation. There's a word for what I did, and it isn't ignorance. Ignorance is when you don't have the information. I had the information. Pete gave it to me standing in that driveway on an October morning. Specific and calm and clearly not a man who was mistaken. I heard every word and I chose, deliberately, to put it down. That's not ignorance. That's a failure of something deeper. A failure of conscience, of the basic willingness to let what is true be more important than what is comfortable. I've thought a lot about why I failed that test. Part of it was love, or what I told myself was love. Part of it was pride. I had spent 31 years as a teacher believing I could read people, and the idea that I had been living blind to something this serious in my own son was simply too costly to accept. But mostly, I think, It was that I had confused watching with seeing. I had watched Nolan his entire life and cataloged everything that confirmed the story I had already written about him. Everything that didn't fit, I edited out. That is not intelligence. Real clear-sightedness, the kind that actually protects the people you love, requires you to be willing to be wrong about the things that matter most to you. It requires you to sit with an uncomfortable piece of information long enough to actually examine it, instead of finding the fastest route to dismissing it. Pete did that. A neighbor who had known my son for 2 years did what I had not done in 37. And Yuna, what she did in those months takes a kind of strength I am not sure I fully have. She was being systematically cut off from money, from work, from connection, and she kept thinking. She kept planning. She packed a bag. She saved $43. She called me once to take my temperature, to find out if I was someone she could count on. That call took courage I can barely imagine, given how little I had given her reason to trust me. Resilience isn't the big dramatic moment of survival. It's every quiet decision to keep going when going has been made nearly impossible. What I carry now at 64 is this: the people we love are not safe just because we love them. Love without attention is just sentiment. Love without the willingness to act on hard truths is, in some circumstances, indistinguishable from looking the other way. I had love for my son. I had almost none of the discipline to question him, to hold him accountable, to see him as someone capable of serious harm. That imbalance cost Yuna months of her life and nearly cost her more. I don't say any of this to perform guilt. I say it because I think most people who end up where I ended up don't arrive there through cruelty. They arrive through comfort, through the accumulated habit of choosing the easier interpretation, the more flattering story, the version that requires the least from them. Pete required something of me, and I turned it down. Yuna required something of me, and she had to wait on a kitchen floor to find out if I would finally show up. I showed up. Late, but I showed up. I think the rest of my life is about trying to understand the distance between those two things and closing it.